Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic: when polar bears knew penguins. Meet the Great Auk. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining in today. I'm going to do things just a smidge differently, and I'm going to tell a story before I jump into the main story. So forgive a brief transgression, but I think it kind of ties in some interesting perspectives here. So if I've got any birder friends on the call, you might already know who the author of this book is. It's a fellow named John James. Let me see if I can get his name right. Audubon? Not quite sure on that one. Again, some of these old names from 1800s probably haven't been said out loud in a while. And he is arguably one of the most famous painters and naturalists who studied birds in the 1800s. And he wrote and painted more than 430 still lifes for this book that was published. Took a couple publications, but from between 1827 and 1836. And 200 years on, which is pretty cool. A lot of this has been made digital. If anyone is interested in going and flicking through it, there are some very, very beautiful paintings of some birds from long ago, some that are still with us, some that are not. But I want to bring our attention to the painting that I had sort of on our waiting screen while we were waiting to start. And so this was done in 1836 by John and by his partner in this, Robert Havell. And so the two of them, so John would paint the birds and Havell would paint the backgrounds. Now, this, I'm going to tell you, is a very interesting thing, is that even though he painted this of these birds, he never actually saw the great auk alive. And so it's an interesting story of how it is that we get to this point in time in history. And so if we roll the clock back a little bit, if we go back to 1833, so John James is already famous. He's already sort of started making his living as a naturalist of collecting all these specimens and painting them, right? And so he hires a ship. He hires a 100-ton schooner to travel from Maine up the coast along Canada to go in along Newfoundland and along Labrador. It will eventually be his last sea voyage. And he gets this ship to go and paint and collect these last birds. And so while he's up there, he paints petrels, eiders, guillemots, murres, things like that. And what he's hoping to find is an auk. Now, while he's there, they're traveling along the coast, and local people tell him that the bird is still alive. Remember, we're in 1833, but they're really rare at this point. And that there's one desolate island left off the coast of Newfoundland, but unfortunately the weather's too rough and they just can't ever make it there. And so he never actually sees them. He only ever gets a secondhand account, actually. The closest thing he gets is, so the engraver who he works with, the man who paints the background, Havell, his brother was on a ship traveling from New York back to London and incidentally caught one of these great auks, brought it on board off the coast of Newfoundland, and apparently it was very kind of clunky, sort of waddling around on deck, very awkward. It tried to bite anybody that would come near it, and it took it a couple days to sort of get its orientation back. And then they let it go and it went back out into the ocean. But when he was meeting all these fishermen and was hearing all these stories, when they were asking people about it, when they were trying to find this bird, what they had to ask for was, they said, have you seen a penguin? Right? So auks are what we call them now, but back in the day, if you'd been roaming along the coast of Newfoundland in the 1830s, you would have either been calling it a penguin or you've been calling it gyrefowl. Those are kind of the two names that it went by along the coast at that point. Now, he never did find a live one, and the way these paintings came to be actually was he ended up purchasing skins, or essentially taxidermied birds of these copies, brought them back and painted them. And to this day, there is no video. There has never been a photograph taken of them because unfortunately they went extinct before photography made its way to access these birds. So they're kind of this elusive myth, I would say, in modern day times. I think most people, unless you happen to have grown up along the coast or along the Atlantic and been in these communities, you probably maybe even haven't even heard of them. Certainly heard birds similar to them, but never them themselves. And so it's a very interesting time when we think about it because, believe it or not, there was a time when polar bears did know penguins, uh, although in a much different way than I think we would think of now. And so that was kind of the inspiration for me for this webinar today. It came from, and actually started my first year when I was guiding back in 2018. So this story maybe has been a long time coming to its full extent. But I've had people over the years, including my very first year as a guide for NatHab, ask me about, what polar bears think about penguins or like how they interact with them. And I had to keep a very straight face because, who's someone who studies biology modern day, that's pretty outlandish, right? Our polar bears are in our southern hemisphere. Our polar bears are in our northern hemisphere. Penguins are in the southern hemisphere, and they've never met before, right? The species that we call penguins now have never been predated upon by polar bears. Polar bears have never been snacking down on penguins as much as this funny egg now that Edgar's gone joke is hanging out on the screen here. But if we could roll back the hands of time, if you were a fisherman in the 1800s, 1700s along the coast, you would have very much seen a polar bear in the same place as you would have seen the animal that they were calling a penguin. So we're going to take a stroll through history, and we're going to understand how is that possible, who and what were these birds, and why is it that this is not a story that no one knows anymore, or at least that I would say lots of people don't know anymore. So we're going to go as far back as stories can take us, and we are going to go to the Beothuk people. So those are the indigenous people who lived on Newfoundland, on the island, around the time of contact from Europeans. So we're talking about 16th century, 1500s, and they're descendants of the Little Passage people who have inhabited that land for at least thousands of years beforehand. So they would have been living along the northern and southern coast of Newfoundland. And these are just an example. These are some drawings left over, but they were collected in the 1820s of some of their house structures, right? So they again would have had, similar to a wigwam, they had bark covered or tent covered skins in the summertime to live in. Then they would have had partially subterraneous homes. So what they would do is they dig half of the home into the earth in the wintertime to reserve that heat. While many people may not realize this, the Beothuk people are often tied to the reason why when Europeans first came over, they called them Red Indians, which has then been tied to a lot of First Nations or Indigenous groups in Canada and North America in general sense. The reason is because the Beothuk people were ones, they took red ochre, which is essentially powdered hematite, so that type of rock that's really bright red. They painted their canoes with it. They painted a lot of their vessels with it, their skin, and so much of them were red. And these would have been earliest points of contact for Indigenous peoples, or for Europeans that saw Indigenous peoples coming back. And so it's not proven in history, but it's most likely that it's these cultures right along the coast of where we get that name from that's been propagated through history. Just as an interesting aside to kind of tie this together. So even though you may have never known that name before, the Beothuk people have actually carried through history quite a long ways. So there would have been their traditional territory in along the island, and then also on the mainland as well, even though this map doesn't show it. So in along the coast of Quebec and in along Newfoundland as well. And so today, historians say that the Beothuk are now extinct, which a lot of Indigenous cultures would disagree with. So what happened was that, again, they're right on the coast of Newfoundland. And so when settlers came, they were some of the first groups that were pushed inwards and lost their territory. They really, really avoided Europeans when they first came. And historians think that's because they had memory and stories from when the Norse Vikings came and inhabited Newfoundland, which, although there was some trade, it was also a pretty rough and tumble time. And so that was almost 500 years later, right? Vikings are coming around 1,000 years, 1,000 BC. And then we have 500 years later, those stories are still held. And so they really avoided them. And so that meant that their homelands were taken over right away. But what we want to think about is how they were playing a role on that island and the animals that they were interacting with at the time. This was the point I wanted to make. So they say that they're extinct now, whereas a lot of Indigenous groups disagree with that in the sense that the Beothuk, when Europeans came, they started intermarrying between other nations. And so the reality is that they survived those bloodlines survive, those people survive, but their culture got integrated with others along the coast there. But Newfoundland is a really beautiful place. It's often called the Rock or the Island. It's a very harsh place to live. And for those cultures that were living there pre-European contact, they played a really integral role in the ecosystem, in the ecology. So there's not a lot of big predators on the island. Yes, there would be wolves, foxes, eagles, things like that. But the reality is that humans were they're one of the big predators there for things like seabirds, right? So this is a really cool photo. It's showing one of the ecological reserves on Newfoundland. And so you can see, or hopefully you'll be able to read that. It's clear enough, right? But there's different species that are all kind of hanging out on the edge of this cliff on this rock. And so that's a huge food source that they tapped into. But it's also a huge control over where these bird colonies would be, right? Because the more accessible places were the ones that the eggs would get hunted more easily, or the adults themselves would get hunted more easily. And so the birds would kind of end up in these really difficult places to get to along these cliffs. And then they're then sort of that back and forth, and there's specialized hunters that are going to get them as well. And so the interaction between all these different seabirds and between the indigenous groups on the island has been happening for thousands of years. And the one we're going to focus on is the great auks, and we're going to focus specifically on this island. It's called Funk Island now. As you can tell, it's really not a lot going on, pretty much just bare rock, but for a seabird, it is a pretty great place to come and to have to lay your eggs. So the Beothuk are coastal people. They're organized in bands all along the coast of Newfoundland, and they would make the trek to Funk Island, which was about a 40-mile paddle. So it wasn't by any means a short means, but it was worth it because there were so many of these birds out there that were easy to hunt. It was a huge food source. So think about it springtime when most other places are really struggling to get at food because it's been a long winter. These people were actually doing really well in the springtime because they had access to such a big food source. And so that early summer egg collection and hunting of adults was really, really critical to this culture at the time. There's lots of evidence out on that stone island of finding these tipped arrows. So I'll get into a little bit as we go along here, but great auks, they are pretty big. They weighed about 11 pounds. And something they share with penguins that we have today is that they have a really thick layer of fat, which is great both as a food source, but from the bird's perspective, that's insulation. But from the hunter's perspective, that's really hard to get through. And so that was where we started finding evidence of stone-tipped darts, arrowheads, things like that, because they couldn't just stun them. They had to get it. They had to get at them that way. So what we think when we look back on the past is that there was probably over 200,000 great auks that were occupying this rock island that they would paddle out to get at this food source. And they would do it once or twice a year. And it was completely worth all of the effort because they would bring back, stories go that they would bring back boatloads of eggs, right? You think about eggs keep really well, amazing food source, as well as the meat and then drying that as well. All right, so I've been talking around the great auk, but I haven't been talking about what the great auk actually is. So they are a large flightless bird, right? Very similar to our penguin, which makes sense where the name is coming from. And they're about 30 inches tall, give or take a little bit. And they weigh anywhere from about 9 to 11 pounds. Males and females, they're about the same size, very similar coloring as well. And this map down here, another, so the dark blue, you can see they would have been all on the coast of Canada, up along Greenland, and they were also in Europe as well, right? So down along Norway, along the coast along Scotland, those yellow dots are where we know that breeding areas would have been. And so they've been known on both sides of the Atlantic for a long time, right? Carl Linnaeus back in the day when he was naming off all the animals that he could think of, these were one of the birds at the time that was already known of. But the accessibility of them and the availability of them was less on the European side where they'd already been harvesting, whereas there was still a lot more of them available, or maybe a more intense harvesting on that side. So where do they fit into the animal kingdom? Where do they fit into the world of birds, right? So auks are related to puffins, they're related to murres, they're in the Alcidae family. So really, if you look at them, they're all our kind of our tuxedo birds, right? Our black and whites. All of the other birds in this family can fly, However, in the birding world, we would call them kind of awkward flyers. Most of them are divers. They spend more time in the ocean than they necessarily do flying around. And so they're all very ocean dependent birds. And so if we go back to what the lifestyle would have been of our great auk, right? So they're spending most of their time in the ocean. Their favorite foods are things like capelin, a small type of herring that was a filter feeder. I'm trying to remember what it was called. And then they also would have been predated upon themselves, right? So some of their big predators while in the water would be eagles, as well as marine mammals. Orcas would be a big ones who would have fed on them. Sorry, I just got a bit of a sniffle, folks. Apologies. Right. So, and then they would have been diving really quite deep. Um, so this is again, there are no photos of them, right? So this is a picture of a Humboldt penguin, but I just wanted to sort of have a perspective of how we would imagine them moving through the water. Um, it's thought that they can dive on average depth for about 75 meters. They can hold their breath for about 15 minutes. Stories go. Some people, there are really sort of, we can't prove or disprove this, but some people say that they could go even further. Some stories say that they could go 500 fathoms, which is about a kilometer, which is not necessarily impossible, right? But there are stories that they could have been very impressively deep divers. We do know that they were deeper divers than all of the other diving birds in their family. So that was one of the advantages they had. They could go deeper and access a different prey source than what was available to them. And what we do know, what we can say about them is we think that they live for about 20 or 25 years, like our emperor penguins of the south. They had one singular egg, sort of often a mottled color, and they would have it on bare rock. And they would mate for life, so both parents would take care of the egg for about 6 weeks. And then it would hatch, and then they would take care of the young for another 3 weeks on the island before they brought them into the ocean. And then they would live as a family group for a few weeks until their young are capable of hunting on their own. So they really are very, very comparable. In biology, we would call a lot of this coevolution, right? So I'm going to tell you that they are not related to emperor penguins, or at least they're really not much more related to them than we are in terms of evolution biology. But they have evolved and filled a very, very similar niche between the two. So I just want to go back because I want to go back into history and I want to think about this distribution, right? So when we're thinking about this, this is a bird that probably existed in its heyday in the millions. It covered most of the northern Atlantic. It was a major food source for indigenous groups here in North America. It was accessible food source for Inuit and those in Greenland and the north, as well as in Iceland. There's communities in Scotland that would have been a major food source for on some of those smaller islands. Yet, what happened, right? Where did they go and why does nobody, at least I would say in my generation until I started reading about it, I didn't even know they existed. So why are they not a part of our stories? Why are there not penguins up north, right? And so the times are changing. And we can sort of, again, let's roll the clock back a little bit. So we know that they've been in these lands for thousands of years, but we're going to go back to the 1500s. And at least in terms of Canadian history, this guy here, Jacques Cartier, was kind of a big deal, or at least certainly left an imprint on these lands and these peoples. So he was one of the first ones to come over, and he described the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Newfoundland. He is where we get the name Canada from because he mistook the Iroquois name for the two villages of Hochelaga and Stadacona, so what is now Quebec City and Montreal. When he met the Iroquois, they said, "Oh, this is welcome, like this is Canada," and he's like, "Oh, the whole thing is Canada," and here we are, some 200 odd years later. But the name stuck, so that's okay. So it's not a bad name. It'll work. But again, the story behind that. So he's French. He 1534 he leaves Europe, and he of course is on the same journey that everyone else is. No one was looking for North America. Everyone was looking for Asia. They were looking for wealth and money, and this darn North America was in their way of trying to get there, right? The hunt for the Northwest Passage, going around, the reason why we eventually have the Panama Canal, all of those things, right, is to make their way around. But on an interesting note, so he left from Europe in April of 1534, And I think this is pretty cool because I did not plan this, I swear, but he arrived on the coast of Newfoundland May 10th, 1534. So everyone, we are on the 490th anniversary date of Jacques Cartier coming to North America, which I think is pretty cool. It's pretty amazing when the universe kind of lines up for things like this. Um, I guess technically it's 1 out of 365 odds, which are pretty small odds if you ask me. So it feels like it was a good thing or a good sign. It was a good reason for me to telling this story. And so Jacques Cartier arrives and he is trying to go up the St. Lawrence. He's trying to find his way across North America to find a route to Asia. But in doing so, right, so they're sailing their ship along. He goes all around the coast of Newfoundland. And of course, on a sailing ship, you need to resupply. They're meeting different people. They do come across the Mi'kmaq. So there's some trading that happens with them. But in the same way that the Beothuk went to Funk Island, so did Cartier. And this, they called it the Isle of Birds because there was so many birds on it. And the story goes that the men got off the ship. Imagine having crossed, you had 20 days journeying across the Atlantic, not knowing what was going to happen. And then you hit this island where these birds are not afraid of you. And they just started, I'm not going to lie, clubbing them and salting them and brining them and putting them in casks and loading them up. Stories go that they killed thousands of birds, most of them being great auks, and loaded them up and brought them for food. And another interesting thing, another story that gets passed down from this time, is that while this was happening, so while his men are on the island hunting these auks, Cartier tells the story of seeing a polar bear swim towards the island to hunt this very same birds, right? So admittedly, we're right on the edge of their range. Now, you might be surprised when we look at this map, saying that's pretty far south. What is a polar bear doing there? Well, we can kind of look at this both from a historical context sense and just from a general current sense. So first of all, if we just start on the picture on the right, what's that showing you? It's the current that brings icebergs down from the north along Baffin Bay, along the coast of Labrador, and down to Newfoundland. And so they're still getting icebergs sort of flowing by them that whole time. So that's the direction of ice flow. Now we can also think about just the extent of sea ice. So the other picture here on the left side, so that dark blue is showing you the very minimum amount of ice variability that they would expect. Green is kind of in the mid-range. Red is what like a maximum extent would be. And so this is showing from the period of 1981 to 2010. And then that yellow star in the middle, that's Funk Island. So really what would happen, and it wasn't super common because we're on the edge of polar bear's range, remember that, but they would come down, they'd come down along the coast, along Labrador, swim across to Newfoundland, and then hang out on northern Newfoundland hunting seals, and some of them would then make the journey further to these islands to hunt the great auk, right? And so we come full circle, right? We are finally having a polar bear meeting a penguin, right? Which is kind of unbelievable if you don't, yeah, in the world that we think about today. But you could think about it in a theoretical sense, right? It's not a literal penguin of what we call penguins today, but it's filling that exact same niche, right? There are these flightless birds that are playing a key role in the marine environment, right? And there's abundance there. So there's this whole, I guess one thing I kind of always think about this, when you think about a species going extinct or a species that doesn't exist anymore, is that that's like a whole component. It's like taking a gear out of a machine. And so when you take that gear out, the whole ecosystem has to now shift to realign. So maybe another species takes its place. Maybe there's less of one kind or more of another, right? In order to keep the whole machine that is ecology going. Maybe a weird analogy, but right. So there was a time where these played a really critical role all along the coast of our Atlantic, and that is now gone. And so it's one of those things when we look back in history, we can't really understand which species took the hardest hit from the loss of them, or if any species actually increased from it, right? We don't have the ability to put perspective on that in history when we're talking about extinction. All right, but we're going to keep rolling through history. So Cartier shows up, 1530s, very exciting time, trying to discover a way to get across Asia. But what he does discover, right, he discovers the birds, he discovers the wildlife, and he brings back news of this amazing, amazing fishing industry, the cod industry, right? He's like, the stories go that there were so many cod that you could walk across the backs of them in the ocean. And so all of the countries, or I shouldn't say all countries, many countries, Spain, Portugal, England, I'm probably forgetting somebody here. France. They start what is sort of the first long distance fishing industry. So I told you it took Cartier 20 days to cross the ocean and come back. So if you can solve the pack of fish, it's actually not unreasonable. Go 20 days, bring them back, right? You also think about those icebergs floating down. There is actually access to ice caches, right? Got to tie this all in. So here's this food source that people start drawing on. Now, back in the day when they first started in the 1500s, they were only taking sort of 30, 40,000 tons, which is still a lot. But by the time we get to the 1800s, when technology has really upped the game, they start taking close to 500,000 tons a year. And even in the 1800s, there are stories of sort of fishermen along Maine saying, hey, the cod are declining, things are not going well, and trying to figure out how to manage this resource. Because that's the unfortunate narrative, right? Is that people come, oh, there's so much abundance, right? It's infinite. That's the notion that gets folks into trouble. That's why we are no longer have a functioning cod industry in the Atlantic. Very similar story is unfortunately starting to brew up here in the Pacific with our salmon. Sorry, one sec. I was doing so good, and then I got sick. I've been sick actually most of the week, but we're on the upswing, so things are looking better. Okay, so but I'm talking about the fishermen, and so here's another species, right, that's on the decline. But I brought up the fishermen for two reasons. One, to understand that there's a shifting ecosystem. Two, because the fishermen are the ones who brought the word penguin. All right, where does the word penguin from? Well, it gets a little confusing, and you could argue about the roots of it, as with any good story and any good words. It's got multiple beginnings. So one of the most commonly accepted one is that it's a Welsh word, right? So think about these fishermen that are coming across. You've got, right, I said we've got men coming from the UK. And so the word Gwen means white in Welsh, and pen means head. So it was white-headed. So great auks, they actually change. They go from having a mask to like raccoons with eyes. So I got to get this right. In the summertime, they have a full white band that goes across from eye to eye. And then the wintertime, they lose the white in the middle, and then they just have two white eyes there. We assume it probably had something to do with mating, or right, sort of a peacocking effect maybe. But again, we don't know, because unfortunately there's none of them left for us to really understand their behaviors with. But that's where this story comes from, and that was why a lot of people are confused as to why penguins are called penguin, because you understand the root of the word. And now I'm talking about our South Pole penguins, because most of them don't have white heads, they have black heads, right? So it gets a bit confusing there. Now, admittedly, there is also another root that could be possible for the word, because when we go to Latin, which is Pinguinus, so that actually comes from the word for fat or plump, which makes sense also because, remember we talked about that layer of fat that's unique for our penguins, both in the northern and southern hemisphere, because that extra layer of fat made them a good food source. Also, it's their insulation because they are our deep divers in some very, very cold waters. So now here's where things I think get kind of fun and confusing. If we go by Latin terms, so great auks are Pinguinus impennis, whereas penguins, which is their common name, are not actually penguins if we go by their Latin names, which means that there are technically, if we're gonna get very technical, there are no penguins in the world today. The penguins that we had are in the past and they died off, and today there are no penguins. So of course, I'm being a bit silly, but that's this notion, right? So everything that we call a penguin in the Southern Hemisphere is technically not a penguin, because how did they get that name, right? Well, all of these ships, explorers, that era of discovery that people like to call it, from the sort of the 16th century onwards for those couple hundred years, those sailors coming from European countries, when they made their way to the Southern Hemisphere, they already knew a black and white bird. They already had one that they were very familiar with. It was the great auk. So when they saw these other birds in the south, they're like, oh, they must be more penguins. But they're not. They're come from a completely different branch. They're not related, but they look very, very similar because they've adapted to very different, or I should say, different poles, but very similar climates. So it's a bit of a misnomer, right? So we've got our great auks, which is the Pinguinus impennis. Then you've got our king penguins on the side here, which are Aptidenites, right? So we have to go a long ways back. We have to go all the way back up to a class level. Basically, we have to say these are both birds, but these birds are really not that similar, even though they look very, very similar, you could argue, right? So coevolution is a really cool thing. It's probably one of my favorite things to study, favorite things to learn about, because, in the same way that, like, cultures evolve and you get different solutions for the same things. It's so cool when you see nature does it physically in this case and also behaviorally, but we see it in people too, right? Um, if I think about Siberian cultures compared to my own cultures, which actually have some very similar landscapes, you have the same problem, but then how do you solve it, right? So nature has that exact same story happening all the time. So this is really cool, right? So I said that we were talking about I've mostly been talking about auks in Newfoundland, but we have them all the way over to Scotland, to the British Isles. So these bones were found by archaeologists, excuse me, in Caithness, which is that area sort of circled in red in Scotland. And so they found it in a midden. So it's a pile of bones left over from where people were hunting and they're harvesting or cleaning their food. And so again, we don't know we don't know a lot about the physiology because all we have is skeletons and taxidermies left over of them. There's only 80 actually in the whole world that are left that we know of. They're very, very rare, even the taxidermy specimens, excuse me. But this is what I want to point with this cool coevolution. So they have different genetic lines, but they've essentially evolved to have very similar structures as penguins. So what we're looking at is two humeri and two tivae. And so this picture here, the bone structure on the left is showing you how a goose wing looks, the bone structure, and then the one on the right shows you what a southern hemisphere penguin, how their bone structure works. And when we're comparing a penguin's physiology to a great auk's physiology, they have the same, so like the bone density is increased, it's filled the same lines, but the ligament attachments are in different spots. And which wrist muscles, right? So this is always, I think, is really cool, right? Because really those are their wrists, right? I mean, I know that they've lost a lot of detail to them because we have all these tiny little bones, but they've evolved to expand those bones and to flesh them out in a different way. And so this is the part that's cool about evolution, is that we can track through the great ox line, through the ligament attachment, their flying ancestor, versus through the penguin, we can track a different non-flying ancestor, the way that the ligaments have come together and which bones, I'm going to say, have expanded to fill that space to function as a flipper and not as a wing. So it's very, very cool because externally they're looking very similar, and even internally it's the function is the same, but how they got there has evolved to be different. So certainly birds of a feather, I would say. And so unfortunately, tragically, as I've said a couple times, the great auk is extinct, which is why we don't have stories of them in most of common history, why we all travel so far to Antarctica to see the thousands upon thousands of penguins living their penguin life, right? We don't have any close to home, and why we make such a trek to do so. But the last known pair of great auks was hunted in Iceland in 1844 on June 3rd. And so that was the last ones that were done. Unfortunately, those ones were taken and done for a collection. I'm right, so they were mating pairs. So there's not been one officially recorded ever since that last pair. Maybe there were some that were hunted, but no one has seen them ever since. Nor do I expect to. It's not like some of these other stories of extinct species where we're finding the odd one here or there. It's been a few hundred years. So I know I've been talking about this mostly from an Atlantic perspective, but I want to just shift, and I want to talk about this also, I've been talking about this from a Canadian Atlantic perspective. Now I want to talk about this from a European Atlantic perspective. So this is St. Kilda. This is one of the places where, again, it was inhabited by people for thousands of years. It's very similar to the Beothuk people. They relied on seabirds as one of their main food sources. It was very, very isolated. And as these birds started to decline, so did sort of the life and culture for the people who lived on this island. So I said the very last great auk, the very last great auks were taken in 1844. 1840s was when they saw the last one here along the British Isles. And it wasn't long after, pretty much by the 1930s, this population of people was forcibly removed from the island because there wasn't any food for left them, and they didn't want to leave. And there's some interesting sort of historical perspectives on this, because while over hunting as a food source for all the fishermen, for people, like that was the reason why they say that they talk about how really near the end it was the collectors who drove it to extinction, because once it became rare and harder to find, then it became honestly a goal or a sport animal, and people would pay to have these animals to get their skins get them taxidermied. Now, in the same way that the Beothuk people were really good hunters of seabirds, so were the people who lived in St. Kilda. And so they were hired. So I think the dark irony of this is there. So their way of life is ending. The seabird populations are going down, but these people are extremely good cliff climbers. That's what they've been for generations. They're really nimble. They can climb. Remember that really sheer cliff rock? These are the type of people who would climb that, get the eggs and things like that. So the story goes that the last ones that were seen on the north of here on Scotland, a collector hired some of these locals to go and catch a pair. And so they did. They climbed down, they caught the ones that were left there on the island. And then the day that they caught them, story goes that it turned into a crazy 3-day long storm. And people still believed in witches at the time along the island. And what they thought happened was that when they caught the last female auk, that she was actually a witch. And another dark turn, they actually beat the auk until it was dead, hoping that the storm would end, but it didn't. And then, right, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is here is that with the loss of this species was also the loss of a complete way of life tied to them. And so they, those people didn't go extinct, right? In the same way that the Beothuk didn't go extinct, they moved back and, they believe that they survived along with the Mi'kmaq, things like that. Those people who'd been living on St. Kilda for years, and now it's a tourist attraction, right? It used to be a place that was inhabited, had a really strong culture. Now I think people mostly just go there to see the birds that are left, right? But it's parallel stories on either side. Which is one thing I think, when we think about why is it sad, or, what truly is the loss of a species with extinction, there is the loss of, or there's so much more than just the species itself. So there's a really interesting book that's kind of focused on this narrative of what happened when the great auk did go extinct. It was written by Giles Pallison. And so his story was about actually not the very last pair of great auks that were hunted in 1844, but about 2 men who went looking for them 12 years later. So he wrote this book about 2 English biologists in 1858, and a couple fellows. So on the left, a fellow by the name of John Woolley, and on the right, a man named Alfred Newton. Now these 2 became friends. Newton was a trained biologist, and I can't remember what training Woolley had, but they became friends, and they made a deal that they were going to go to Iceland, and they were going to try and find the last auks, because at this point, right, so it's 1844, they've become extremely rare throughout the early 1800s. People don't know if they're extinct, right? That's the other thing about extinction, is that it's really hard to have the proof that every single one is gone, especially again thinking about the time and the era. So they're kind of going to prove, is it still there? Is it not there? And also, if it is there, they weren't planning on killing one. They wanted to find out what they were like, right? How did they live? What was, like, again, if there are any left, what's their colony structure? There's all these questions that people had that they don't have the answers to, because yes, people had been living alongside them for thousands of years, but the peoples and cultures who were most familiar with them had become disconnected from them. So all we have is stories that way, and we have become sort of a world that's obsessed with written and documented things. So we're at that turn of the era where everything must be documented. It's not documented, it's not real. And that's kind of the era that these men are belonging to. So they were hoping to find out, beyond just the images and drawings that people had, what were these great auks really like. So they went to Iceland, they made it there, and then they got told, so this is the island. Eldey Island is where the very last fishermen ever went and caught the 2 great auks in 1844. And so they were told that if they could get out to this island, there might still be a few pairs there, but people don't go there very often anymore. And again, sort of very similar back to Audubon back in the beginning, when I was talking about, right, when he was trying to get to Newfoundland to get to this island to see the last few pairs. The weather was terrible, and try as they might, they couldn't get anyone who was willing to take them out there because the storms were so bad. And so, much to their disappointment, they gave up on trying to find any living pairs that they could, and they changed their tactics, and they went looking for the 11 fishermen who were on the boat that caught those fish in 1844. Now, story goes that there was 11 of them on the boat, and 3 of them went on shore and caught the very last pair for the collector at the time. And so they went and they asked them all of these questions, everything they knew about the birds, from like what color were their feet and their eyes, right? Because an interesting thing about this is that once a bird dies, there are things that actually change. So their eye color changes, their beak color can change. So even though we have taxidermy specimens of them, it's a very small thing, but it is really interesting to note that like we don't actually know what color their eyes were, um, right? Might seem like a small thing, but it's something that we can never really know. And so in an interesting way, this was sort of a marking of an extinction. The notes that Newton and Woolley took, there's 900 pages of them stored off in Cambridge. And even though there are documents of extinction before this, this is kind of a turning point um, in our understanding of species and their survival, because it's the first one where we have a biologist arguing that it is humans that are the cause of the extinction. So if you want to go, if you make your way to Iceland, which I hope folks at some point have a chance to, you can actually get to Eldi Island, and they do have a marker there as in a mod of respect for the last great auk pair that was found on the island. And but I'll give a bit of a forewarning before I go to this next slide in case some people are a bit squeamish. Um, it's it's the hearts of the very last great auk. So I'm going to tell you that before I go to the slide. If you don't want to look, you can look away. It's not gruesome. It's just they're the old specimens of it. So I just know some people are more taking that note if you're a biologist or if you've been dissecting biology. But it's this fascination, right? That's what we have left. We have the taxidermies, and they have kept the organs of this, which I think is, admittedly, it's a bit morbid, but it's just sort of fascinating, right? It's this notion that they had to be collected in order to be preserved, and by doing so, we snowballed and ended the species rather than preserving the living species. So um, there's a lot of talk, or I shouldn't say there's a lot of talk. We can talk about what is it that led to their demise, right? So some species are just automatically more vulnerable than others. When we think about the great auk, they are a large flightless bird. So again, that's actually a really common story with a lot of other birds that are facing or have faced extinction or extirpation. The moas, the dodo, right, as our most famous one, most likely. So it makes them harder to get away. So easy prey access that way. Another one is that these birds never really learn to fear humans, right? And so unfortunately, that familiarity also led to their demise because they didn't flee as soon as people went onto these islands. And so the third part, which more has to do with their reproductive biology, which again is something to keep in mind for species today, is that they only had one egg and they didn't reproduce if that egg was taken. So if you think about these big hunting parties, these massive pressures, right? Think about the cod industry and all those hungry fishermen that needed to get fed. Well, they would go to the coast, catch as many birds as they could, catch as many eggs as they could, even if they don't get the adult mating pairs. But then that bird isn't going to reproduce for that year. And that means that they have to wait till the whole next year to have one. And so it's really, really vulnerable when your reproduction rate as a species is so darn low. And these are the things we really think the big key points as to why they went extinct. And so this I think is so interesting in retrospect. So Newton at the time, he is arguing that humans have caused extinction. And this is, it might seem strange in today's world, in the same way that as weird as it is thinking about a penguin knowing a polar bear today. Well, back then, people didn't think that humans could cause extinction. Actually, he had to argue a lot, even though it's really common now. He had to argue that, we can show the hunting pressure, we can show the evidence, we can show the overexploitation being the reasons that these are not extinct. And who else was around at the time, and who was his opponent on this arguing stream, was no one other than Charles Darwin, right? So Darwin didn't want to hear about humans being the cause of extinction. In his theory of the world and his theories of biology, extinction happened on the scale of millennia or longer, right? So this notion that humans could be a driver for it didn't fit into his notion of how the world works. Which now, as someone who's learned biology 400 years later, this is very much a part of our narrative, and we think about that quite consciously. So again, to be a bit taken aback as one of these sort of forefront minds, right? It's a good learning curve in one thing. One, just because you have an idea doesn't mean that you need to, or let me back that up a little bit. Fully supporting Darwin's ideas, right? You have to understand the context of the people in the time that they're in. And right, like, because he's disagreeing about something that we now think is very much true, um, and very much hold on to and have that energy. What's the word I'm looking for? Having that perspective of. There we go. So the world has changed a lot, I would certainly say, since the since 1534 and since 1836 and since 1844, when our last known great ox left this world. And so, they have gone, as the saying goes, the way of the dodo. They have gone extinct. The dodo did go extinct for arguably very similar reasons, um, but it was less documented at the time. And that's kind of the reason why the great ox sort of marks this era where people really start honing in on what role we can play in the ecosystem as a whole, right? Because think about it, humans have been hunting ox for thousands of years before this time. And it's only now with that overexploitation, or it's only then with that overexploitation, that they shifted gears on that. So it's a very complicated story. It takes a lot of different components, a lot of different ways, but it just goes to show how very different our sort of Arctic ecosystem used to function, that there was this massive player in the game, right? We did have northern penguins, um, and they did play a huge, huge role in that ecosystem, that are gone now. And so we're a few hundred years on, but the likelihood is we're actually still feeling ricochet effects or ripple effects of that even today. So I realize I've got a good amount of time here. I'm going to stop here and I'll hand it back to Rob if we've got any questions for the end here.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much, Christina. Now, before we start in with some questions, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have some questions, please feel free to submit them in the question field in the control panel. So let me ask you this, Christina. Is there enough DNA available to bring back the great auk?
We're getting very Jurassic Parky here, aren't we? Um, I do not know. I am not a geneticist. We do have, okay, what do I do know? We do know that we have bone specimens of them. We do have arguably quite a bit of DNA that's been preserved, either through taxidermies or through skeletons. So in theory, there is DNA available. Um, do we have enough to bring it back? You're getting into like ethical questions and some other evolutionary things, and um, I don't know. I don't. I'll throw my own personal perspective on this. I don't think back is ever the solution. I think this notion that we can get back to things is unhealthy, and the reason is because nature is dynamic. You can't preserve nature. You can't put it. It's not like a jar of jam. You can't leave it on the shelf and it'll stay the same. If you blink, if you look away for a minute, nature will keep changing. Um, and the moral of this story is that not that I think, or at least in terms of the extinction portion of this story, is that uh, like to being conscious of what it is we're taking and what it is we're doing, right? When I think about the history of these animals, and they were actually, if I'm also going to sort of blow up a bit of history here, sorry, this is turning into a longer answer, but um, so the reality is that they've looked at great auk populations as humans sort of started to take over, and the reality is that they were probably even more abundant, and then humans came, and then the auks were forced to islands that were least accessible. That's why that Funk Island, it was 40 miles away, right? It was very far away for people with paddle. So we already were a pressure on them, right? It's not about, but it's like, are you taking more than what a whole system can handle? And if you take something out of a system, what are the consequences of that? If we put things back into a system, right? Even if we bring something that wasn't here 300 years ago and put it back into the system, will that be good for it? I mean, that good is very much a matter of who you're talking to. The species that have replaced it in that ecosystem might be upset. The ones that need that food source, um, it's all a very delicate balance, and I won't pretend I'm one of the Jurassic Park characters and I know which way the balance should go.
Well, thank you so much for taking a stab at that one. Um, so if I wanted to see where the stuffed ox are, is there where they displayed anywhere? Can we visit them or see them anyhow?
Yeah. Okay. So I know that there is one in the Royal Museum in Ontario, which I think is in Ottawa. They own one. They bought it for $12,000 in the 1960s. It was a very big deal. Um, and I think there is one or two on in Iceland. Um, and to be honest, I am not sure where the others are kept. I'm sure quite a few are actually probably in private collections, and then a handful across the world. I would imagine there's got to be one in London. I'm trying to think the last time I was at their Natural History Museum was a long time ago though. But that would be my other three guesses. Otherwise, you'll have to give it a Google. I'm sorry, I don't know beyond those ones.
No worries. Thank you so much, Kristina. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have for today. So I'm going to hand it back to you for any closing comments you may have.
Lovely. Thank you, Rob. Well, thank you everyone for joining in. This is, I would say, it's a very long historic narrative in the telling, and it's taken me 5 years to properly tell it and to bring it all together. I still can't believe that today is May 10th, which is the anniversary of the voyage. So that's pretty darn cool. And yeah, just that I think that I don't know, my take homes from this is at least the learnings that I've gotten from it is that perspective is so important, right? I wanted to laugh at someone who said that penguins and polar bears used to know, are together, and then I realized historically they could have been. So always have a lot of it's good to remember for humility, and also just the impact of change, right? There's all of these things that we're still sort of living out the consequences of hundreds of years on. So yeah, all decisions matter, all choices matter. I think that's what I hope to learn from the great Auk, even though I will never get to meet one. So thank you everyone, and I'll pass it back to you, Rob.
Kristina, thank you so much for taking the time to present this fascinating topic to us today. So many people have given us a positive comment, so thank you. So if you are interested in information now on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.